Thank you all for joining us today for our program, Champions of Equality, Indigenous Feminist, Zitkala-Ša, also known as Gertrude Bonnin. My name is Olivia Errico. I am the program manager here at API. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us for our first program in our new virtual series, Champions of Equality. This is a series that features conversations with activists, artists, academics, and educators on people from the past and present who have made an impact on the fight for gender equality. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you all to join me for our land acknowledgement. So the land on which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, known as Lenape-Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this land for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Tribe Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tom Amend that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Before I introduce our guest today, I just want to remind everyone that we invite you to share your questions during the Q&A portion of our program. At API, we are dedicated to making all our spaces virtual and otherwise safe and inclusive for everyone. Harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during API programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, trans, or homophobic speech, or any other kind of harassment or bullying behavior, they will be removed from the program without further warning. Thank you for being a part of our community and for partnering with us to make sure we remain dedicated to equality for all in word and deed. So I would like to thank and welcome Dr. Cathleen Cahill and Dr. June DePonte Sernak for joining us today. Dr. Cahill is a Walter L. Ferrari and Helen P. Ferrari Professor in Middle American History at the Pennsylvania State University. She is the author of 2 books and multiple articles. Her most recent book, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, received honorable mention for the Armitage Jameson Book Prize in Western Women's History, and honorable mention for the Society for the Study of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era's President's Book Prize. Dr. June DePonte Sernak is chair of the board of directors at the Alice Paul Institute. She is the second woman of color and the first person descended from Indigenous people to serve in this role. Dr. Sernak currently serves as the statewide diversity consultant for the Center for Family Services, located in Voorhees, New Jersey, where she provides consultations on cultural competence planning and implementation. So thank you both again for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cahill.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. I really appreciate that. And thank you for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here today and to be in conversation with Dr. Sernak. And I'm really grateful that people took the time out of their lunch hours to come here. So I'm going to share my screen to put up a PowerPoint. Let's see. And so I want to start with an image that I think encapsulates what we often think of when we hear about women's suffrage, right? Sort of, this is the suffrage portrait monument that's currently in the US Capitol. It was placed there in 1921 on the day before a major National Women's Party conference that Alice Paul had called together kind of post 19th Amendment to think about the future. And it was a portrait monument that meant to encapsulate the past of the movement, the important leaders, right? People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it has the kind of final 4th piece left unsculpted at pointing to the future and kind of future leaders. But again, these were all white women. And this is generally, if you Google or if you're reading things, the stories you're about when you're talking about women's suffrage. So what I wanted to do today was focus on Zitkala-Ša, also known as Gertrude Bonnin. She's one of the 3 Native women that I write about in my book, Recasting the Vote. And that book explores the activism of 6 women of color, 3 of whom are these Native women. And initially, when I wrote the book, I wasn't going to talk about her. I thought we kind of knew a lot about her. And so I was going to focus on these other 2 women, Marie Bottineau Baldwin, who's Turtle Mountain Chippewa and French from what is now North Dakota, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's Wisconsin Oneida. And they're all her contemporaries. They all knew each other. But it turns out that she and her story was really essential to the discussion of Native women and voting rights activism and feminism in this early period. And there was really no way for me not to talk about her. And we did know a lot about her, but there was so much more. So in this talk, I'm going to try to give you a quick overview of her and her activism. But again, it's really hard to fit all of that in about 25 minutes. So please ask questions and we'll get to a little more in the Q&A. So she was an advocate, like both of these other women, for women's rights, but also Indigenous rights. And her story reminds us that we really can't separate those 2, that they really come together. And I try to emphasize this in the book, that women of color came to the voting rights movement often out of their activism around questions of civil rights, or in Native women's case, sovereignty rights and treaty rights. And so just remembering that women come to the fight for suffrage from many different places and bringing different motivations and different hopes for what the vote will do for their communities, I think is just a really important thing to kind of hang on to. So by including their stories in our suffrage histories, I think that it both diversifies those histories, which is important, but it also demonstrates the sort of many different strategies that women brought, and I think we can learn from those strategies. And also this emphasis on, representation matters. And our country is a very diverse country, and our history is extremely diverse. And without understanding the stories of these women, we don't really fully appreciate or understand the history that brings us to our present, where, for example, the legacy and history that meant that the first 2 Native women were elected to Congress in 2018, almost 100 years after the 19th Amendment was the first time we had Native women as representatives in Congress. And that was Kansas's Sharice Davids, who's a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and then Deb Haaland from New Mexico, is a member of Laguna Pueblo, citizen of Laguna Pueblo, who then in 2022 became the first Native woman to serve in a cabinet position under President Joe Biden, where she's Secretary of the Interior. And those stories, their stories, their histories were at least 100 years in the making, and we see how Indigenous feminists at the turn of the century, are part of the reason that they could make it where they are. But this history also includes women who serve in tribal government, women who serve in voting activism across Indian country, and women who serve in social services and in other forms of activism that address Native women's experiences, There's a long history of that. This isn't new. So as I said, I think Zitkala-Ša, or Gertrude Simons, which is when she was born, that was her name. She was born in 1876, which, if you know U.S. history, you know is also the year of the Custer defeat at the Battle of Greasy Grass, or the Battle of which I should know, Little Bighorn, It's more usually known as Little Bighorn. So she's born into the middle of what are often called the Indian Wars. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army is really turning to the American West and forcing the indigenous nations there onto reservations and really using the power of this army that's come out of the Civil War to do that. And when she's 8 years old, she ends up going to a missionary school in Indiana. So for the first 8 years of her life, and we know quite a bit about her biography from her own writings. You see 2 of her books here. She talks about those first 8 years living on the reservation in South Dakota with her mother, who is a Yankton Dakota woman, but her father, who was a white man, had basically abandoned the family. So she talks about growing up in this sort of matriarchal world with her mother and her aunts in a pretty idyllic, traditional childhood. And when she turns 8, missionaries come to the reservation and kind of lure her away. So she doesn't go to a federal boarding school. This is a Quaker-run school in Indiana, but they make her all kinds of promises, especially about food, which I think is significant, right? She can eat all the apples she wants if she comes to their school. And as an 8-year-old, this is really compelling to her. Her mother doesn't want her to leave, and that's significant, but she goes. And she uses her experiences in school to write later these very compelling stories, which are mostly autobiographical, but are also a critique of the federal Indian policy at the time. So, and she really emphasizes that her relationship with her mother suffered from going to boarding school, right? Being lured to boarding school and being there. And this was honestly the goal of federal Indian policy at the time. Up until 1871, the federal government had treated Native nations as, right, sort of foreign nations with whom they had diplomatic relationships. So they were signing treaties, and those treaties were legally binding under international law. And in 1871, the federal government said, we're not doing that anymore. And in fact, we're going to initiate what became known as the policy of assimilation, which was to refuse to recognize Native nations as nations and to focus on individual Native people and try to quote unquote civilize them, right? So erase their Native cultures and make them indistinguishable from other American citizens. And the government used sort of 3 big tactics to do this. Land, law, and education is how historians describe it. So in terms of land, it was breaking up the communally held reservations, which had been stipulated by treaty that these would be lands held by those nations. The government breaks those treaties and divides them into individual plots, which they handed out to people, individual Native people, and the rest that was seen as excess was sold, right? So the point was to basically make them homesteaders. Various laws were passed outlawing Native religions. There's the infamous law in the early 20th century that requires men to have short hair, right, to cut their hair. So laws that kind of really micromanage Native people's individual lives and experiences. And then education, which is a really key component of this, which is the development of a federal boarding school system across the nation. There were ultimately 35 off-reservation boarding schools. The first one was built in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, right, near all of us. And there were numerous on-reservation boarding schools as well. And the point was to take Native children away from their families, away from their cultures, and educate them as if they were, right, white children, and to talk about how what they had learned in their families was bad and uncivilized, and what they were learning in the schools was good and civilized. So you can see, and part of the reason we know about how Native children felt about this is through Zitkala-Sha's writing, and it was very, very painful to her. When she goes back home, and she's not alone in this, she feels really disconnected from her mother, from her family members, even from the place. And she ends up going back to Indiana to attend college at Earlham, which is a Quaker college. And there, I want to tell you an experience she had that I think really encapsulates her sort of intersectional identity, that her identity as a woman and also her identity as a Native person, and how you can't take those things apart, and how her activism really stemmed from being both positioned in both of those. So she already as a freshman in college was an incredible speaker, right? She would go on to, that's one of her claims to fame. And she enters the school speaking contest, and she gives a speech that's called Side by Side. And it is a speech about the relationship between the sexes. And we don't have the text of the speech, but we have the title, right? Side by Side, suggesting equality. And apparently this was a really incredible speech. And as a freshman, she wins the school contest, right? It was very much, the seniors were all very irked that she won. But because she wins, she is going to represent Earlham at the state college speaking contest, which is going to take place in Indianapolis. And the school, everyone at the school is behind her. They're very excited. But she decides, and this is really unusual, to rewrite her winning speech and to change it. So where it had been about the relationship between the sexes, the speech she delivers in Indianapolis is actually about the relationship between the US and Native nations. Same title, Side by Side, right? And in that speech, we do have the text of the speech, and she starts by reminding the crowd of the violence in the history of Native US relations. And she says, the white man's bullet decimates his tribes and drives him from his home, right? And she's using the convention of the time of him for a group. And it's important to remember that this is 1895. So it's just 5 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee, right? Where federal troops have opened fired on a camp of Lakota people and killed a number of about 300 Lakota, most of whom were women and children, right? So this happens in South Dakota, not on her reservation, but on South Dakota. And so it's upmost in her mind. But she also, despite that history, although she wants it to be acknowledged and remembered, is calling for a future that includes both Native people and white Americans in the US's future, right? And she says that, we seek to, we're seeking by a new birthright to unite with yours our claim to a common country, right? So she's saying, right, that she sees a vision for a future in which side by side Native people and white Americans can exist. And this is a theme she's going to return to over and over again. And I think these two speeches give her a good sense of her insistence that white Americans need to understand the history of Native-white relations, and also her vision for how Native people, men and women, are going to fit into a future in the US. And her position as a Native woman isn't just incidental to this, right? I think it's really key. So her first speech, as I said, is about sex equality, but also when she's standing on the stage in Indianapolis, after she's given her speech, a group from another school unfurls a banner in the crowd, and it kind of falls down where she can see it, and it's a banner that's mocking her for being there, and it uses the racist sexualized slur, and excuse me for saying it, but it's of squaw, right? And this is really upsetting to her because she understands that it's aimed at her specifically as a woman, but also specifically as a Native woman. So she can't, right? She's not gonna be able to separate those two things in her activism. After college, she is very unusual in that she's a Native woman who's gone to college, or a woman who's gone to college at this time. And she's looking around for kind of what to do. She takes a job in the Federal Indian Service, which might seem strange. These are the people who are working in the schools, and she actually ends up working at Carlisle. But there aren't a lot of other jobs for Native people who have been educated, except for these federal jobs. She works there just for a few years and she's torn. She has some problems with the assimilation policy and the its rejection of Indigenous culture. She's also someone who's has a lot of other goals. In particular, she was a master violinist, and she decides to leave Carlisle and ends up going to study violin at the Boston Music Conservatory. And you can see a picture here of her from around that time. She is studying in Boston. She even takes a European tour where she's playing in France. And this is the time where she starts writing those short stories, and that will be put into her book, her first book. They're published in major magazines like The Atlantic, right? And her stories are critical of federal policy and are asking sort of white Americans to recognize the kinds of pain that Native children are going through as they're being taken away from their families, and told that everything about their communities, right, should be rejected. So those experiences, and especially her time as a musician, teach her a lot about staging and performativity and kind of capturing an audience and presenting herself. And she's going to use those skills throughout the rest of her life. She, a little bit after that, meets and marries another Yankton Dakota, a man named Raymond Bonnin. And he is, excuse me, also working for the Federal Indian Service. And he gets stationed out in Utah, right? Far from home. This happened a lot to Native employees. She tries to get a position working on the reservation or in one of the schools. And even though she's a college graduate, right, very well educated, she cannot get anything more than like a temporary position or an assistant position because she's Native and her superiors don't think she should have a different job. So she's very frustrated by this. She ends up doing a lot of work with the Ute women on the reservation, kind of social work. She creates sewing circles. She tries to bring people together to kind of have conversations about how they can combat the poverty and health issues and general kind of depression of reservation life at this time. It's very hard. It's very, there's a lot of poverty. And that also influences her. And she continues to work on her music. She actually co-writes an opera during this time called the Sundance Opera that is kind of a celebration of the Dakota and Lakota religious ceremony of the Sundance. So again, kind of celebrating Indigenous traditions, even as the federal government's trying to get rid of them at this time. And she also becomes involved in a new organization called the Society of American Indians. And this isn't a great slide, but you can see the first conference of this organization in 1911. It's a group of Native people, many of whom are also, like Bonnin, well-educated in kind of Western terms. Many worked for the federal government and were critical of that, and formed an organization similar to the NAACP, which is formed around the same time, that is advocating for Native citizenship in the United States. So one thing I should have mentioned is that under assimilation policy, again, the federal government had gotten rid of Native governments and had said that Native people should become citizens, but they have to stay in a period of wardship, right? They have to learn how to become civilized first before they can become citizens. So legally, Native people are not US citizens, but are also not seen as citizens of their own nations. So they're in this legal limbo where the federal government is their, they are wards of the federal government. And so the Society of American Indians is pushing back against that, and is, again, advocating for treaty rights to be recognized, advocating for Indigenous people to become US citizens so they have some sort of political voice, and also pushing back against a lot of the stereotypes that Native people faced. So the women of the SAI actually write an article about why the word squaw should not be used, right? I think that was in like 1912, so, right, a very long time ago. And let me just show how some of those stereotypes influenced the women's suffrage movement, because this is important. Oh, I'm sorry. So here's a sense of what the Society of American Indians was doing. This is actually a white cartoonist in Cedar Rapids, but I think it's a really good encapsulation, right? There are these stereotypes about Native people, again, as uncivilized, that the SAI was really hoping to, both through their personal appearance, through their conferences, through their journal that they had, where people would publish articles, to break those stereotypes, to show that Native people could, in fact, be modern, but also arguing that they didn't have to give up all of their cultural traditions to do that, right? So in the same way that Gertrude Bonnin could be a classically trained violinist, she also is writing operas that celebrate her Indigenous religious traditions. And sometimes suffragists used that negative stereotype. So this was an image, it's kind of a which one of these is not like the others image. The woman in the middle is Frances Willard, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And this portrait was painted for the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And it was it was an argument about why white women should have suffrage. That clearly Frances Willard was nothing like these other people that are surrounding her, but none of them could vote, right? So we have a convict, and then the two men kind of in the top left and the bottom right are men who are mentally ill. And then you have a Native man, right? So none of them could vote, and neither could Willard. And the implied argument here was, well, of course she should. She's nothing like these other men, right? So that's sort of the darker stereotype. But at the same time, suffragists also embraced this idea that Native women who lived in matriarchal traditions offered some examples of women with political power and political rights that white women didn't have. And this is especially the case around Haudenosaunee or Iroquois women. And you see this is a slightly later political cartoon from 1913. And you see the Haudenosaunee women here as sort of foremothers who are kind of disappearing into the background while women suffragists are marching forward, right? And we see Cat and possibly Stanton in there. And there's this sense that, right, it's a criticism of white society where women don't have the same rights that Haudenosaunee women had, but it's also a sense that the future is for these white suffragists while Native women kind of look on from the past. And that's one of the other stereotypes, is that Native people are disappearing, right? If they're not going to be fully just assimilated into American society, they're going to die out because they can't handle modernity. And that's another thing that the SAI was arguing against. But part of the reason white suffragists have these stories, on one hand, people like Matilda Joslyn Gage were going to upstate New York to visit Haudenosaunee communities and listening to Native women, but also the women that we see in this kind of 19-teens moment in the Society of American Indians were also making that case. We're reminding white suffragists of this history of Native women's political power. So let's see. Very quickly, let me just get us to Gertrude Bonnin and to 1920, and then I think I'll pause and open it to conversation. But she gets elected as treasurer of the Society of American, Secretary of Society of American Indians in 1917 from Utah, and she actually moves to Washington, D.C. with her husband. And she kind of explodes on the scene. She's already known as a writer from those earlier articles and her first book. And she's also involved with the Women's Christian Temperance. One. So the thing she does in And she actually lives quite close to Lafayette Square, where at this point in 1917, right, the National years during the fight for the amendment, the 19th Amendment, to speak to women's groups, often suffrage groups like the Anthony Society, but also broader women's groups. And as we saw here, she uses photography. She passes out her image to reporters to put it in the paper, and she's sort of all over the papers. And she very deliberately wears this dress that she knows will get her audience's attention. So she calls it her drawing card. And so she's using it very deliberately to do a couple things. And I just want to mention her strategies, and then I'll stop. So this first strategy is to play with this idea that Native people are disappearing, right? She knows people will want to see her because she's part of a disappearing culture. And when they come to her talks, she tells them, right? She'll tell them kind of traditional stories. She'll sing Native songs, but then she hits them with, and here are the problems that the Indians face today. And one of her lectures was called The Indians Past and Present, right? So she emphasizes the present, right? So there's this ongoing, Native people aren't disappearing, but they do have some issues that she wants her audience to know about. So she's educating them and asking them to use their political power, be it the vote that they might get or their influence on their husbands to help fix them. She also always talks about, right, the treaties as part of that past. It's a history, and argues that those treaties need to be upheld because they are not in this moment. The second, and I think this points out how her voting rights advocacy is not just for women, it's women and men. This is World War I. Her husband enlists in the army. He's a quartermaster. And she points out that many Native men, disproportionate to their percentage of the population, have volunteered for service, and most of them are not citizens of the US, right? And she says they're fighting for the nation owes them citizenship. And so again, her advocacy is for both, not just women, but for Native women and men. And then there's World War I. In 1920, right, the ratification of the 19th Amendment happens, but Bonnin points out that the fight for Native people is not over. And she actually, as I said, I mentioned we opened with the portrait statue that was dedicated at that 1921 conference. Well, she's actually at that 1921 conference. She's invited to speak. And she, as you can see here, made a plea for the recognition of the rights of Indians. And her speech to the National Women's Party basically says, right, the fight for voting rights is not over. Native women don't have the right to vote, and neither do Native men. So she says, your sisters, right, are asking you to help continue the fight for voting rights. So I think I'll stop there to give us time to have a conversation. And we can get into what happens next, I think, in the Q&A. So,
well, thank you so much. This is just such a remarkable topic. I feel like such a kindred spirit with Zitkala-Ša just on so many levels. And I listened to your presentation and realized how it really isn't that long ago. And it's also a period of time where these things are very similar to what we're seeing today. So it's even more of a true story of everything that you have spoken about, of lessons to be learned. A couple of questions that we had prepared, and then we'll go to our audience to also get some additional questions. But just seeing Zitkala-Ša as a woman who felt like she was a mixed race woman, she always describes herself living in two worlds, which was deeply conflicting to her, between the Native identity and the white identity that she had, not only in the boarding school, but then in the education system. You know, this really reminds me of the term that people say now, like imposter syndrome. Do you get that feeling like that was almost the onset of feeling like you don't necessarily belong in a certain place, even though her education is overwhelming and her talents are overwhelming, but yet she's not accepted freely?
yes, Absolutely. And I think she was a very strong person because that's something that she's running into all the time, right? And she doesn't seem to let it stop her. I'm sure it hurt, right? I'm sure it did, but it seems to also inspire her to kind of keep fighting, knowing that she's fighting for herself, but she's also fighting, right, for future generations. So there's the example where she couldn't get this job in the Indian service in Utah. She's so frustrated by that because, again, she's way, much more qualified than many of the people who were in those positions. But you see it again later when she and her husband in Washington, D.C., when they will, there's another organization they'll form in 1926, National Council of American Indians. And what she wants to do is basically, it's almost like a lobbyist group. They go to congressional hearings that have to do with Native issues to kind of watch what Congress is doing and to then kind of disseminate the news out to Indian country. And sometimes she's also testifying. And at one point, a congressman just treats her horribly, right? He's belittles her in his speech on the floor. He sort of dismisses her work and just is really awful to her. And he's the congressman from South Dakota. And so she, this is in 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act and Native people are able to vote. It's complicated, but they're going to be able to vote. And so she basically campaigns against him, right? And tries to mobilize voters in South Dakota to get him kicked out of office. It doesn't work. But, right, it sort of puts him on notice that the Native people in South Dakota have heard about how horribly he's treated her. And that reflects poorly on kind of all of Native people. So I think she used it to drive her in her activism. And I think that's, yeah, it's impressive.
So the one photograph that you showed of all of them gathered in 1911, both my grandmothers were born in 1911. So it's really not that long ago. And I know that their stories are very similar. I know that one of the things that you spoke of, even to reflect in New Jersey, we don't have federal recognition. We have state recognition. So a lot of those programs and things we don't get the entitlement for, which is really impactful. So we still hear those stories today. And I keep reflecting on the fact that her life and Alice Paul's life also really have a lot of parallels. There are these women that went through turbulent times. Like I can't imagine the boarding school process, whether it was Carlisle or whether it was a Quaker school on reservation. But these, they were able to achieve these high education standards, because you almost feel like there's a language barrier here, but they're able to achieve these degrees. And they have really a possession of resiliency that is almost unbelievable. So their fight for equality is unparalleled. So I know she wasn't alive to see the Citizen Act actually go into place. And I know that even Alice today, we talk about it being the centennial of the suffrage movement for the ERA. Can you elaborate also on possibly where resilience like this comes from? Because I think that a lot of women are trying to figure out where can they get involved with advocacy, and knowing that sometimes they feel like they don't have a story to tell. But these women, they made that story their passion.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. Kind of how to feel where to start, right? And I think, we see these women like Zitkala-Ša or Alice Paul, and we know their stories, right? We've seen the end of the story, and we see how impactful they were and what a difference they made, but they didn't know that when they were just starting out, right? And so I think, their lives were really a series of small steps that built. And so I think starting small is okay, because you'll get somewhere eventually. And I think what both of their lives show us is, their stories and their work mattered to people, right? And they may not have seen how it mattered initially, but it does, right? Her Zitkala-Sha's stories, those early stories that she writes when she's very young, she's just graduated from college, have a very broad audience, and they become part of a conversation that does make white Americans start to question the federal assimilation policy, right? To see it from her point of view, to recognize, because, you know, all of these reformers who are often called the friends of the Indian talked about how this was, you know, they were helping Native people, and this was kind of a gift of education. And her, by telling her stories, she made them question that, and made them question whether this was the right way to help people, right? And so that that starts a much larger conversation that eventually will lead to the 1924 Citizenship Act, and then the Indian Reorganization Act of the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, which is where the federal government finally kind of re-recognizes Native nations as nations. It's not the end, right? There's a lot of history after that, and Native people constantly have to push for recognition of their rights. And as you point out, right, there are a lot of unrecognized tribes, right? And being recognized by the federal government brings resources, and also kind of an acknowledgement of history that's really important. And so that's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, resources and limitations. Yeah, in the 1400s, there were 60 million Native Americans. Now we're around 9 million nationwide, and about 30,000 in New Jersey. So yeah, we absolutely are still here. So we see a lot of these conversations taking place, especially in the circles that I'm in the mental health and addiction space. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I wanted to just quickly ask you about as well, she really is, she looks like she's Wonder Woman. Married, she has a child, she's a scholar, she's a musician, she's got all these talents. And so many people struggle with trying to have it all. And you mentioned a little bit about, you know, she did things just in little chunks and was able to move forward with that. But what would you think about, like, where we are today, even with some of the things, because Alice really put her personal life on hold to be able to achieve her accomplishments, where it seems like Zitkala-Ša, she was able to kind of balance a little bit of both, and maybe that's cultural as well. Mm-hmm. But what are your thoughts around how women are perceived in those types of roles? Because we see it in personal and professional lives always, that you're always kind of put to the side, depending on what track you pick. And I think that it's so important to see that she was able to really accomplish all those things in her lifetime.
I mean, I think in terms of her activism, particularly when she moves to Washington, she and her husband are sort of partners in that. You know, he's also part of the society. He goes to law school at one point, gets his law degree. In the 1920s, they are both, you know, they found this National Council of American Indians, but she's the president, but he's doing a lot of the work with her. They're traveling a lot, kind of trying to get it off the ground. So I think she has support from her partner, which is certainly not always the case, especially in that period. What she doesn't have is, right, because she lived away from her community in Yankton, both partly their jobs, right, which took them to Utah and then to Washington. She has sort of a community of Indigenous people in Washington. There are lots of Native people there. It's the nation's capital. The BIA is there, right? Diplomats and folks are coming through all the time. So there is a community there, but she doesn't have sort of an extended family there, which if, right, on the reservation, she might have had that kind of support. So she's very successful, right, in her career as an activist, as a writer. It seems like her relationship with her husband is very good. Her relationship with her son is a little less. That's a little more complicated. She sends him to boarding school at a certain point. I think because precisely in this moment, it's hard to be a mother and be a working woman, right? There's not really models for that, especially you know, for a political activist. Many of the suffragists, right, don't marry and have children. Some of them because they're not interested in men, but some of them because they recognize at that moment, like they kind of have to choose. Birth control isn't great. And, you know, being a working mother is frowned upon, especially if you're middle or upper class. So that part I think was hard for her to balance, but she balances so many other things in her life.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and seems so similar to where women are still fighting for that, you know, equity in 2023.
Right.
So I don't know if there are any other questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we welcome you to submit your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I have a question for you, Dr. Cahill, actually. So you mentioned that Zitkala-Ša moved to DC in 1917, is that correct? So do you know if she was aware of, interacted with any of the National Women's Party activism that was happening in DC at that time?
So I do know she speaks at their headquarters at least once, right? I definitely know she did that. And she lives just a few blocks from Lafayette Square. So I'm sure, right, I'm sure she was aware of, and certainly would have been reading all the newspapers, right? Because she's in town and she's very close to where all the picketing's happening. And she's a suffragist, right? She's active in that campaign. It was harder for women of color to get involved in some of the radical activism that the National Women's Party was doing at that point, right? Particularly once the picketers start getting arrested and put in jail. The only people of color that we know of that participated in those pickets was Mary Church Terrell and her daughter Phyllis, so an African-American suffragist. And even they, once it starts getting, right, once the women start getting attacked and arrested, they kind of step back because for women of color, right, they're not granted the automatic respectability that white women are, right? They're seen as, you know, white women could picket and hope that their sort of their whiteness and their class status would protect them from getting attacked, and it doesn't, but it does help them kind of get out of jail eventually, right? That's it. Part of the reason people are so horrified is because these are upstanding white women, and women of color don't have that same kind of protection. So they are less likely to be involved in some of those really radical suffrage protests. But absolutely, she was there. She knew them, right? They know of her. They clearly invite her to be at that conference in 1921. And, you know, she asks, right? She says to them, and Mary Church Terrell is also there and says the same thing, like the fight isn't over, right? Not all women have the right to vote yet. Native women were still federal wards. Black women in the election of 1920 experienced all kinds of disenfranchisement, just like Black men. And Alice Paul is not really interested in that. She basically says congressional legislation can fix that. And the National Women's Party ends up focusing on the Equal Rights Amendment. But what's interesting about that is one of they introduced the ERA in Congress for the first time in 1923. And the politician who introduces it in the Senate is a senator from Kansas named Charles Curtis. And the ERA was a big supporter of Curtis, and he's a big supporter, the National Women's Party, he's a big supporter of women's rights, and he supported them. And so they ask him to introduce the ERA, which he is happy to do, right? So the first time it's introduced in Congress, in the Senate, it's introduced by Charles Curtis, who is himself a Native man. He's a member of the Kaw Nation. Everybody in DC knows he's Native. And so he supports the ERA when it's first introduced. And he eventually becomes Herbert Hoover's vice president. So his history we don't usually hear about, but I think it's pretty significant that he supported the ERA. Gertrude Bonnin goes to a different group of white women, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and asks them to help her kind of keep this fight going, and they do. They hire her to do two really significant things. First, they hire her to be a lecturer, and they just send her around the nation giving talks, and her talks about Native people and citizenship. And one of her talks at that time is called Americanize the First American. And so you can see she's saying, right, we were here first, the first American, and we don't have citizenship, right? So she's calling for citizenship and the right to vote. So there's that, and that is very helpful in terms of Congress passing that 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. But the other really significant thing she does for them, and I think if you've seen the movie Killers of the Flower Moon, right, we're having these conversations about the Osage, the guardianship system, right? That's part of this federal wardship, lack of citizenship for Native people. They sent her to Oklahoma as their agent, along with two other men who are working for other reform groups, the Indian Rights Association and a third group, and they do an investigation of that guardianship system in Oklahoma. And because she's the only woman on that team, she does a lot of interviewing with Native women, very similar stories to what we see in that movie, right? Not that family, but other women, because this was a much wider spread phenomenon. So talking about how kind of explicitly about violence that those Native women faced, but also the ways in which their property was being taken from them, and some of the murders and other ways in which, again, that system was structured. And so they write this report, they publish a report in 1921 about that. It's called Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians. It's one of the ways in which we know about some of these broader stories. And politicians in Congress dismiss them, and they dismiss her. And again, in another instance where she's really frustrated, they say things like, oh, they just found some outliers, or they even say they're making things up. And so she, again, tries to, after 1924, target one of those Oklahoma politicians with asking Native people to kind of vote against him because of this. And he actually loses his office. May not fully have been because of her, but it certainly helped. So, she's, the ERA is happening, but she's also her activism continues to be a mix of voting rights activism, but also specifically about these issues that Native people are really, really care about, because their communities are facing these really horrible systems of inequality.
Yeah, we're actually seeing that today. I attended the Governor's Stigma Council conference yesterday. And that was one of the first things that was brought up was addiction and mental health issues within the Native American communities. And their numbers are exorbitant, even higher than the African American community and Latino communities as far as marginalized populations. So there's additional work to be done to get the help to meet people where they are, and to continue these conversations. I think it's also like what you've pointed out and throughout your presentation, things that happen in the Midwest and West Coast where you might have seen more reservation population. It was easier to identify who was Native versus on the East Coast where some migrated through that they weren't necessarily counted the same way. So that kind of misappropriation of racial profiling still takes place in a lot of areas because they assimilated into whatever communities they resembled mostly in those areas, and it's not really in the census. Even my great-great-grandparents, their census documents changed from Virginia to Delaware to New Jersey for over the years. So there's a lot to unpack in this history, and there's a lot to still appreciate about all these things. I learned something new every single day, and Killers of the Flower Moon was really an emotional journey to watch that happen when that similar things are happening today. So I think that's where that secondary trauma comes into, wow, we were really not as far along as we thought. But any other questions in the chat feature, Olivia?
Yeah, I have one. So can you just tell us a little bit more about the end of her life? What was the last years of her life like?
Yeah, so she continues to be active. As I said, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act is passed. Native peoples are all granted U.S. citizenship. Now, not all of them wanted it. That's a different story. But there are plenty of people who said we're citizens of our own nations. We don't need U.S. citizenship. But Gertrude Bonnin sees it as a real opportunity because she hopes that Native people can really use their vote kind of as swing voters, right? Especially in states like Oklahoma or South Dakota, where they have enough people that they maybe can shift some of the politics, get people elected who are going to help uphold treaties, get people elected who are not racist, right? So she forms this organization called the National Council of American Indians. And at that point, she really changes from working really closely with white women's organizations to trying to create organizations on reservations, in reservation communities. And kind of, it's a get out the vote effort, essentially. So she and Raymond travel all around the Midwest, trying to talk about what this new Citizenship Act means, trying to get Native people to register to vote and start to vote. And they are, right? In the 1920s, you see headlines about Native people voting all the time. Charles Curtis gets elected in 1928, right? There's this sense that this is a new moment. But what you also see in that period is backlash and a lot of Western states passing laws that are very similar to what we think of Jim Crow South laws, right? So literacy tests that Native people are forced to take, or dropping everybody's voter registration and then making it really hard for anyone who lives on a reservation to register because all the registration offices are very far away. Things like that, right? Lots of different, very clever ways of suppressing the Native vote, right? This is another ongoing issue. And so she's really frustrated by this. She writes about her frustration, but she keeps, right, trying to she keeps working towards that. And again, part of what she does in the off season, like during the winter or when Congress is in session, is she and Raymond are there kind of watching Congress, trying to spread that kind of information to everyone. This is what Congress is doing, and here's how it's affecting Indian country. And I was saying right earlier that I think she would have done amazing things with social media, right? She's using print journalism and she's writing letters, connecting with kind of political activists across the country, but I imagine what she could do with like a blog or, Twitter. So, and then she passes away in Washington, D.C. in 1938. And as a very last act, and I don't know if this is her or if it's Raymond, but because he's a veteran, he can be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and he applies for a plot. She dies before he does. And the tombstone that they erect, and let me just show you the picture of it, because I think this is really significant. And we can end with 2 more pictures. The tombstone that they put up in Arlington, right, the National Cemetery, both has their name with this teepee image, right? So really kind of asserting their Native identity here, but also, right, it's also asserting a U.S., right, as citizen of the United States, right, that he was in the U.S. Army and his wife, Zitkala-Ša of the Sioux Indians. So really putting, these things that she advocated for her whole life, that she could be essentially a dual citizen, both of the Sioux Nation, right, or Yankton Dakota, but also of the U.S. And then I just want to end to let you know that next year, as part of the American Women Quarters program, she's one of the 5 women who will appear in the 2024 quarter set. So you can see kind of the different suggested or different submissions for the quarter, and then the one on the right is the one that will come out. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you, Dr. Cahill. I have one final question that I think would be a great wrap up that came in through the chat. So where can people go if they want to learn more?
Oh, okay. And I suspect actually Dr. Sernak has ideas too. I would say a great place to start to think about some of these assimilation policies and their continued importance. There's a fantastic podcast called This Land that does such a wonderful job of explaining what is an incredibly complicated history. I think that one's wonderful, and it ties it into the recent McGirt Supreme Court decision. So it shows the legacy and the long history.
Yeah, and so I would also add, come to the Alice Paul Institute in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Come learn about the things that we're doing. Next year, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary, so we have a lot of programming coming up for that as well. We do have her adulthood home, the Belmont Paul House in DC, which is close to the Library of Congress. There's a lot of information between Belmont Paul and Paulsdale that is just amazing. I would also recommend you picking up Dr. Cahill's book, Recasting the Vote. I think that that's just a really enlightening space for us to learn everything that we need. And Zitkala-Ša's book happens to still be in circulation, because I have a copy of the American Indian Stories book that I've reflected on many times. And I don't know if I can still get Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians as well, but that would be something that I would say to learn a little bit more about kind of the entire glimpse of what this picture looks like. And there are a couple different services that if you want to come to us, we can give you some additional content. Things from the Smithsonian about being respectful of Native American culture, how to write a land acknowledgement, and just some of the other things to make sure that you do know that we are still here. And these stories are really, really reminiscent of things that we all should know and learn in our history, since we probably did not get them in our history books growing up.
There's I think I put it in the chat, but there's a digital, you can get Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians online. I just typed it in. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you
a wonderful
again.
conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. And thank you, for a fantastic conversation. And thanks for the questions.
Yeah. So thank you again, Dr. Cahill and Dr. Sernak, for joining us. And for everyone else for joining us for today's Champions of Equality Lunch and Learn. If you enjoyed the program and you would like to help us continue to highlight important voices in the fight for equality, please consider making a donation at alicepaul.org. And I just want to boost one more upcoming program. So we will be officially reopening Paulsdale after our restoration project and celebrating Alice Paul's birthday on January 13th. So if you are local to Paulsdale and you would like to join us, please check out our website for more information about that. So thank you all again. This was an amazing conversation, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.